June 320 BC. Babylon's sweltering heat pressed down on the assembled generals surrounding Alexander the Great's deathbed. The 32-year-old conqueror's labored breathing filled the silence. Among the weathered faces stood Seleucus, son of Antiochus, a man whose unremarkable appearance belied an ambition that would reshape the ancient world. Standing just over average height with typical Macedonian features, Seleucus bore the scars of a professional soldier who'd risen through merit rather than birth. As one of Alexander's 7 elite bodyguards, he'd witnessed the systematic conquest of the Persian Empire. But here's what's remarkable. This man would forge an empire that would last nearly 3 centuries and bridge east and west in ways never seen before. When Alexander whispered his final words, allegedly to the strongest, he left behind an empire stretching from Greece to India with no clear successor. His half-brother Philip III suffered severe mental disabilities. His unborn child by Roxana remained months from birth. The compromised solution, a joint kingship under regency, satisfied no one and merely postponed inevitable struggle for power. In the initial partition at Babylon, Seleucus received the satrapy of Babylonia. Contemporary observers might have considered this a consolation prize compared to prestigious appointments given to others. Ptolemy secured Egypt with its legendary wealth. Antigonus claimed strategically vital regions of Asia Minor. Yet, Seleucus's seemingly modest allocation encompassed the economic heartland of ancient Mesopotamia, with sophisticated irrigation systems, established trade networks, and symbolic significance as the seat of both Babylonian and Persian imperial power. The fragile peace crumbled within 2 years. The Diadochi, Alexander's successors, began their relentless struggle for supremacy. Perdiccas, wielding regency authority, attempted to maintain central control, but his heavy-handed methods alienated potential allies. When he invaded Egypt in 321 BC to force Ptolemy's submission, his own officers murdered him during the disastrous campaign. The Macedonian world plunged into open warfare that would last for decades. Seleucus demonstrated remarkable political acumen during these early conflicts, carefully avoiding mistakes that destroyed other Diadochi. While Eumenes exhausted his forces in futile attempts to maintain royal legitimacy, and Antigonus overextended himself pursuing Alexander's entire inheritance, Seleucus focused on consolidating his position in Babylonia. He cultivated relationships with local priesthood, particularly influential Babylonian astronomers and temple administrators controlling vast economic resources. Unlike many Macedonian rulers viewing local customs with contempt, Seleucus participated in traditional Babylonian religious ceremonies and presented himself as legitimate successor to the Achaemenid kings. This wasn't just politics, it was genius. The turning point came in 316 BC when Antigonus, having eliminated rivals and consolidated control over Asia Minor and the Levant, turned his attention to Mesopotamia. Antigonus's son Demetrius, already earning his epithet Poliorcetes for innovative siege techniques, led a massive army eastward. Faced with overwhelming force and lacking reliable allies, Seleucus made the strategic decision that would define his career. Rather than face certain defeat, he abandoned Babylon and fled eastward toward India. This retreat, which lesser men might have considered humiliating exile, became the foundation of Seleucus's eventual triumph. The eastern satrapies of Alexander's empire had remained largely autonomous since the conqueror's death. Seleucus's arrival in Bactria and Sogdiana coincided with growing instability along the Indian frontier, where Chandragupta Maurya had begun systematic conquest of territories Alexander had briefly held beyond the Indus River. Chandragupta, founder of the Mauryan Empire, represented a new type of Indian ruler combining traditional subcontinental political concepts with lessons learned from Alexander's campaigns. Unlike fragmented kingdoms that had fallen to Macedonian phalanxes, Chandragupta had created a centralized state capable of fielding massive armies with thousands of war elephants, creatures that continued to terrorize Hellenistic armies decades after Alexander's death. Rather than contest Chandragupta's expansion through costly warfare, Seleucus negotiated the treaty that would transform his strategic position. The agreement finalized around 305 BC represented a masterpiece of pragmatic diplomacy benefiting both rulers. Seleucus ceded territories east of the Hindu Kush, regions impossible to hold permanently given their distance from Hellenistic population centers and cultural affinity with the Indian subcontinent. In exchange, Chandragupta provided 500 war elephants that would prove decisive in Seleucus's subsequent campaigns against his Macedonian rivals. Think about that, 500 war elephants, each standing approximately 8 feet at the shoulder, carrying crews of 3 or 4 men armed with javelins, bows, and long spears. The psychological impact of these creatures on enemy formations often proved more valuable than their direct combat effectiveness. Horses unaccustomed to their scent would panic. Infantry formations would break ranks to avoid being trampled. Seleucus's elephant corps became the most formidable in the Hellenistic world, providing him with decisive advantage in battles that would follow. But the treaty's significance extended beyond military hardware. It established diplomatic precedent that would characterize Seleucid policy toward the east throughout the empire's history. Rather than attempting to impose direct Macedonian rule over culturally distinct populations, Seleucus recognized practical limits of Hellenistic power and sought accommodation with indigenous rulers who could provide stability and resources. Returning to Mesopotamia in 312 BC with his Indian allies, Seleucus found the political landscape dramatically altered. Antigonus had become embroiled in conflicts with Ptolemy and Cassander, leaving only skeleton force to hold Babylon. The city's population, grown weary of Antigonid taxation and military conscription, welcomed Seleucus as a liberator. His restoration to power, which he would later commemorate as the beginning of the Seleucid era, marked the start of his transformation from regional satrap to imperial contender. This date, 312 BC, would be used for dating throughout the empire for centuries. The administrative system Seleucus established drew upon diverse governmental traditions of his vast territories while maintaining military supremacy essential for Macedonian rule. At its foundation lay the Macedonian phalanx, that revolutionary infantry formation that had conquered the known world under Philip II and Alexander. Seleucus maintained the traditional 16-rank deep formation, armed with the sarissa, the 18-foot pike that had broken Persian cavalry charges and Indian elephant attacks alike. However, he adapted the phalanx's composition to reflect demographic realities of his empire, incorporating Iranian and Mesopotamian recruits alongside Macedonian and Greek settlers. The heavy cavalry required more careful management. The companion cavalry that had charged beside Alexander consisted primarily of Macedonian nobles whose families possessed wealth necessary to maintain war horses and heavy equipment. Seleucus supplemented these traditional units with Iranian horsemen, particularly the renowned Parthian and Bactrian cavalry whose skills had impressed Alexander's generals. These eastern horsemen brought different fighting techniques, including the devastating combination of mounted archery and shock charges that would later characterize Parthian military success. The integration of local administrative practices proved equally crucial to Seleucid success. The Persian Empire had governed its diverse territories through a sophisticated system of satrapies, balancing central authority with local autonomy. Each satrap maintained responsibility for tax collection, military recruitment, and local justice while acknowledging supreme authority of the great king. Seleucus preserved this framework while inserting Macedonian and Greek officials at key positions, creating a hybrid system that could function effectively across cultural boundaries. This wasn't random, it was brilliant synthesis of East and West. Babylonian administrative practices contributed essential elements to this emerging system. The region's ancient tradition of written records maintained by professional scribes using cuneiform script provided bureaucratic foundation necessary for governing a multi-ethnic empire. Seleucus retained Babylonian practice of detailed record-keeping for tax assessment, land tenure, and legal proceedings, while introducing Greek as the language of high administration. This bilingual approach ensured continuity with established practices while facilitating communication with other Hellenistic kingdoms. The religious dimension reflected the same pragmatic synthesis. Seleucus participated in traditional Babylonian ceremonies, including the annual Akitu festival that renewed the king's divine mandate, while simultaneously promoting worship of Macedonian and Greek deities. The famous cylinder of Antiochus, discovered at Borsippa, demonstrates this religious syncretism by recording royal devotion to both Nabu, the Babylonian god of writing and wisdom, and Apollo, the patron deity of the Seleucid dynasty. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was sophisticated religious diplomacy. Urban foundation represented perhaps the most visible manifestation of Seleucid cultural policy and administrative strategy. Unlike the Persian Empire, which generally governed through existing cities, the Hellenistic kingdoms created new urban centers designed to serve as focal points for Greek culture and Macedonian military power. Seleucus proved particularly ambitious in this regard, founding dozens of cities throughout his territories and earning recognition as one of history's greatest city builders. Antioch on the Orontes, established around 300 BC, exemplified Seleucid urban planning at its most sophisticated. Located approximately 20 miles inland from the Mediterranean coast, Antioch occupied a strategic position controlling access to both the Syrian interior and sea routes connecting Egypt with Asia Minor. The site selection demonstrated careful consideration of military, economic, and political factors. The city's layout reflected orthogonal planning principles that had become standard in Greek urban design. Wide streets intersected at right angles, creating regular city blocks. The main thoroughfare, later known as the Colonnaded Street, stretched for nearly 2 miles and featured covered walkways that would become characteristic of Hellenistic urban architecture. Public spaces included massive agora surrounded by stoas, theatre, capable of seating thousands, and gymnasium where young men received physical and intellectual training defining Greek education. Seleucia on the Tigris, founded around 305 BC, served different strategic purposes while reflecting similar planning principles. Located on the west bank of the Tigris River, approximately 30 miles north of Babylon, the new city was designed to serve as administrative capital of the empire's eastern territories. Its position provided easy access to both Mesopotamian agricultural regions and trade routes connecting Iran with the Mediterranean world. The decision to establish a new capital rather than simply occupying Babylon demonstrated Seleucus's understanding of symbolic dimensions of imperial power. Babylon carried associations with both Persian rule and Alexander's death that complicated its use as a Seleucid center. The city's rapid growth, reaching a population of several 100,000 within a generation, testified to the success of this approach. The urban planning incorporated lessons learned from both Greek and Mesopotamian traditions. The city featured regular street grid characteristic of Hellenistic foundations, but its buildings reflected adaptations to local climate and building materials. Extensive use of fired brick, a Mesopotamian specialty, created structures that could withstand the region's extreme temperatures and occasional flooding. Both cities served as centers for cultural transformation Seleucus sought to achieve throughout his empire. The assassination of Seleucus I Nicator in 281 BC at Lysimachia marked the end of an era and thrust his son Antiochus I into unprecedented responsibility. Antiochus, who had already governed eastern territories as co-ruler for nearly 2 decades, inherited an empire stretching across 3 continents, but faced centrifugal forces threatening to tear it apart. Unlike his father's gradual accumulation of power through military conquest and diplomatic maneuvering, Antiochus confronted immediate challenges that would test every aspect of Seleucid administrative and military capability. The sheer geographic scope presented logistical nightmares no previous state had attempted to solve. From the Aegean islands, where Greek settlers maintained traditional polis institutions, to the Bactrian highlands, where Iranian nobles commanded feudal armies, the empire encompassed territories with fundamentally different political traditions, economic systems, and cultural expectations. A message sent from Antioch to the eastern satrapies required months to arrive, making centralized decision-making nearly impossible for urgent matters. This communication lag meant provincial governors necessarily operated with considerable autonomy, creating opportunities for ambitious satraps to establish independent power bases. Antiochus's approach to governing this vast domain reflected lessons learned during his Eastern apprenticeship under his father. Rather than attempting to impose uniform Macedonian institutions across all territories, he developed a flexible administrative system adapting to local conditions while maintaining essential imperial prerogatives. In Western territories, where Greek and Macedonian populations concentrated in urban centers, traditional Hellenistic governmental forms predominated. City councils elected from property classes managed local affairs, while royal officials supervised tax collection and military recruitment. The eastern provinces retained more Persian-era administrative structures, with Iranian nobles serving as intermediaries between the Seleucid court and local populations. The military challenges facing Antiochus I were equally complex. The Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt had emerged from the Diadochi Wars as the Seleucids' primary rival, controlling the wealthy Nile Valley and maintaining a formidable navy dominating the eastern Mediterranean. Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, who assumed power in 283 BC, possessed both resources and ambition necessary to challenge Seleucid expansion westward while supporting rebellions within Seleucid territory. The First Syrian War, which erupted around 274 BC, established the pattern of Ptolemaic-Seleucid conflict that would persist for over a century. The immediate cause involved competing claims to Coeli Syria, the region encompassing modern Lebanon, southern Syria, and Palestine that controlled vital trade routes connecting Egypt with Mesopotamia and Anatolia. This territory's strategic importance extended far beyond its agricultural wealth, as control over the Levantine corridor determined which power could project force between the eastern Mediterranean and the Asian interior. Ptolemaic strategy relied heavily on naval superiority and ability to foment rebellions within Seleucid territory. Egyptian fleets based in Cyprus and the Aegean islands could intercept Seleucid communications and supply lines while supporting local uprisings against imperial authority. Antiochus III's response demonstrated military innovations that would characterize Seleucid warfare throughout the empire's existence. Unable to match Ptolemaic naval strength, he focused on developing land forces capable of rapid deployment across vast distances. The traditional Macedonian phalanx remained the core of Seleucid armies, but Antiochus expanded its ethnic composition to include Iranian and Mesopotamian recruits trained in Greek fighting techniques. These mixed phalanxes proved remarkably effective, combining Macedonian discipline with numerical strength necessary for extended campaigns. The integration of various ethnic military traditions created a uniquely Seleucid approach to warfare, distinguishing their armies from other Hellenistic forces. Iranian horsemen brought centuries of experience in mounted archery and tactical flexibility that had made Persian cavalry legendary. These units, organized as cataphracts with both horse and rider, protected by scale armor, provided shock capability necessary to break enemy formations. The distinctive appearance of these heavily armored cavalrymen, with their long lances and elaborate horse armor, became synonymous with Seleucid military power. The war elephants inherited from Seleucus's treaty with Chandragupta remained the most spectacular component of Seleucid forces. Though their tactical employment evolved considerably under Antiochus I, early Hellenistic commanders had used elephants primarily as shock troops, relying on their psychological impact to break enemy formations. Antiochus developed more sophisticated tactics, integrating elephant units with cavalry and infantry formations, creating combined arms teams capable of exploiting breakthrough opportunities. Each elephant carried crew of 4 men, a mahout who controlled the animal, 2 archers providing covering fire, and spearmen engaging enemy infantry at close range. The most dramatic test of Antiochus's military reforms came not from ongoing conflict with Egypt, but from an unexpected invasion threatening the empire's Anatolian territories. Around 278 BC, massive Celtic tribes known to Greeks as Galatians crossed the Hellespont and began ravaging western Asia Minor. These warriors, part of great Celtic migrations that had terrorized Europe for generations, brought military techniques and cultural practices completely foreign to Mediterranean warfare. Their sudden appearance created panic throughout Greek cities of the Aegean coast and threatened to destabilize the entire region. The Gallic invasion differed fundamentally from traditional conflicts between Hellenistic kingdoms, as Celtic warriors showed little interest in territorial conquest or political accommodation. Instead, they conducted systematic raids designed to extract tribute from settled populations while avoiding decisive battles with organized armies. Their tactics emphasized mobility and psychological warfare, war bands appearing suddenly to devastate agricultural areas before disappearing into the Anatolian interior. The Celts' reputation for ferocity, enhanced by their practice of taking heads as trophies and their apparent indifference to death in battle, demoralized local populations and made resistance seem futile. Antiochus's decision to personally lead a major expedition against the Galatians reflected both the severity of the threat and his recognition that successful intervention could establish Seleucid authority throughout Anatolia. The campaign, organized around 275 BC, represented the largest military operation mounted by the Seleucids since the Diadochi Wars, involving forces drawn from throughout the empire and demonstrating logistical capabilities that would sustain Seleucid power for the next 2 centuries. The decisive battle fought near modern Ankara showcased tactical innovations Antiochus had developed during his reign. The Seleucid army deployed in formation, maximizing advantages of their diverse military components while neutralizing Celtic strengths. The phalanx occupied the center, its 18-foot pikes creating impenetrable barrier against Celtic charges. Cataphract cavalry protected the flanks, their heavy armor providing protection against Celtic javelins, while their lances could penetrate Celtic shields and mail. The war elephants, positioned at key points throughout the formation, served both as mobile strongpoints and psychological weapons designed to disrupt Celtic battle lines. The Celtic forces, estimated over 40,000 warriors, initially attempted their traditional tactics of mass charges designed to break enemy formations through sheer ferocity. However, the disciplined Seleucid phalanxes held firm against repeated assaults, while the cataphracts conducted flanking attacks, preventing the Celts from concentrating their forces effectively. The elephants proved particularly devastating. Celtic horses had never encountered such creatures and fled in panic, disrupting the mobility essential to Celtic tactics. The battle's climax came when Antiochus personally led a cavalry charge that broke the Celtic center and transformed orderly withdrawal into general rout. Rather than attempting to exterminate the Celtic tribes or drive them back across the Hellespont, Antiochus negotiated settlement that transformed potential enemies into useful allies. The surviving Galatians, estimated at approximately 20,000 people, received grants of land in central Anatolia, where they could maintain traditional social organization while serving as buffer against future invasions. and this settlement created the region known as Galatia, where Celtic tribes maintained distinctive culture for centuries while gradually adopting Greek and Anatolian influences. The Galatians retained traditional warrior culture and tribal organization, but their military service to the Seleucid crown provided regular income and access to Mediterranean trade networks. But then catastrophe struck. The death of Seleucus I Nicator in 293 BC during a disastrous campaign in Anatolia thrust his 18-year-old brother Antiochus onto the throne at a moment when the Seleucid Empire teetered on the brink of dissolution. The young king, later known as Antiochus III or Antiochus the Great, inherited territories ravaged by rebellions, provincial governors asserting independence, and external enemies pressing against every frontier. The empire his great-great-grandfather had forged through military genius and diplomatic skill had shrunk to barely half its original size, with vast regions from Bactria to Anatolia either in open revolt or effectively autonomous under local strongmen. The immediate challenges facing the new monarch would have daunted a ruler twice his age and experience. In the east, the Parthian Arsaces II had consolidated control over the Iranian plateau and was systematically absorbing former Seleucid territories. The Greco-Bactrian kingdom under Diodotus had established complete independence beyond the Hindu Kush. Closer to the imperial heartland, the satrap Molon controlled Mesopotamia and had proclaimed himself king, commanding loyalty of troops who'd served his family for generations. In Anatolia, Achaeus, the king's own cousin and former regent, had assumed royal titles and controlled most of Asia Minor. Yet Antiochus III would transform this desperate situation into foundation for most spectacular military achievements in Seleucid history. His reign marked the empire's final golden age, a period when Seleucid armies once again marched from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, and Seleucid diplomats negotiated as equals with Rome and Egypt. This remarkable recovery began with systematic reconquest of rebellious territories. The campaign against Molon in 221 BC demonstrated military and political skills that would characterize Antiochus's entire reign. The decisive encounter occurred near the ancient city of Apollonia on the Tigris, where Molon had concentrated his forces in strong defensive position. The rebel army, estimated at nearly 50,000 men, consisted primarily of Iranian troops whose families had served the Seleucid crown for generations, but who had transferred allegiance to Molon out of frustration with royal policies. Antiochus's victory resulted not from superior equipment or tactics, but from his personal leadership and political acumen. On the morning of battle, the young king rode along his battle lines without helmet or armor, speaking directly to Iranian soldiers in fluent Persian. When the battle began, entire units from Molon's army changed sides, transforming what might have been costly victory into complete rout. With western and central territories secured, Antiochus could finally address the larger strategic challenge posed by loss of the empire's eastern provinces. The Iranian plateau and central Asian territories that had been integral parts of the Seleucid Empire since its foundation now lay under control of independent rulers who had systematically expanded their domains at imperial expense. The Parthian kingdom, established by the Arsacid dynasty around 247 BC, controlled vital trade routes connecting Mesopotamia with Central Asia. The Greco-Bactrian kingdom, founded by Diodotus around 250 BC, dominated wealthy agricultural regions beyond the Hindu Kush. The eastern campaigns, which Antiochus launched in 212 BC and which contemporary sources termed his Anabasis, in conscious imitation of Alexander's conquests, represented the largest military undertaking in Seleucid history since the Diadochi Wars. The expedition required unprecedented logistical preparation, as the king needed to transport and supply massive army across thousands of miles of difficult terrain while maintaining communications with Western territories. The royal forces eventually assembled for the campaign included approximately 100,000 men drawn from throughout the empire, along with siege engines, supply trains, and administrative apparatus necessary to govern reconquered territories. The army's composition reflected the multi-ethnic character that had become characteristic of Seleucid military forces. The corps consisted of Macedonian phalanxes recruited from military colonies that earlier kings had established throughout Syria and Mesopotamia. These settlements, originally founded to provide reliable military manpower while spreading Greek culture, had evolved into hereditary military castes whose members received land grants in exchange for military service. Iranian cavalry units formed another crucial component, providing mobility and striking power necessary for warfare across vast distances of Central Asia. The expedition's advance into Parthian territory in 209 BC encountered determined resistance from Arsaces III, who had assembled a confederation of Iranian tribes united by their opposition to Seleucid restoration. The Parthian military system, based on traditional Iranian emphasis on cavalry warfare, presented tactical challenges differing significantly from conventional armies Antiochus had faced in earlier campaigns. Parthian forces avoided direct confrontation with the Seleucid phalanx, instead employing hit-and-run tactics exploiting their superior mobility to harass supply lines and isolated detachments. The decisive encounter occurred near Hekatompelos, the Parthian capital, where Arsaces finally accepted battle in defense of his kingdom's heartland. The Parthian army, estimated at approximately 40,000 men, consisted primarily of mounted archers whose tactics had been refined through decades of warfare. Antiochus's victory resulted from tactical innovations that neutralized Parthian advantages while exploiting strengths of his own diverse forces. He deployed his phalanxes in defensive formation that could absorb Parthian arrow attacks while his own archers and artillery provided counterfire. The cataphract cavalry, held in reserve until the crucial moment, delivered coordinated charge that broke the Parthian line. The campaign against the Greco-Bactrian kingdom presented different challenges as King Euthydemus commanded forces trained in Macedonian tactics similar to those employed by the Seleucids themselves. The siege of Bactra, which lasted nearly 3 years, became a test of endurance, pushing both armies to their limits. The city's position in fertile oases surrounded by desert made it nearly impregnable to direct assault, while its extensive fortifications incorporated latest developments in defensive architecture. Antiochus's eventual success resulted from a combination of military pressure and diplomatic negotiation, producing a treaty recognizing Bactrian autonomy under Seleucid suzerainty. The eastern campaigns concluded with Antiochus's advance to the Indus River, where he renewed treaty relationships that Seleucus I had established with Indian kingdoms 2 generations earlier. The agreement with the Mauryan Empire confirmed Seleucid claims to tribute and diplomatic precedence, while acknowledging Indian control over territories beyond traditional imperial frontier. The return to Antioch in 205 BC marked culmination of most successful military campaign in Seleucid history since the empire's foundation. Antiochus had restored imperial authority over territories that had been independent for nearly half a century, while demonstrating that Seleucid power could still project itself across vast distances separating the Mediterranean from Central Asia. But this triumph would ultimately precipitate the confrontation marking the beginning of Seleucid decline. Rome, emerging victorious from its Second Punic War against Hannibal, now possessed both military capability and strategic interest to intervene decisively in Eastern Mediterranean affairs. The Roman Republic's expansion into Greek affairs had proceeded gradually throughout the 3rd century BC, but Roman senators recognized that the Eastern Mediterranean's wealth and strategic position made it too valuable to remain under control of potentially hostile monarchies. Antiochus III's decision to expand into Europe represented both logical culmination of his victorious campaigns and fundamental miscalculation of the changing strategic environment. The crossing of the Hellespont in 196 BC with an army of approximately 60,000 men marked Antiochus's entry into the European political system that Rome increasingly dominated. The Seleucid forces that established themselves in Thrace represented the most formidable Eastern army that had appeared in Europe since Alexander's successors had fought their great battles 2 centuries earlier. The outbreak of hostilities in 192 BC began with relatively minor engagements that failed to reveal the true scale of conflict that would follow. The Battle of Thermopylae in 191 BC provided the first major test of Seleucid military capabilities against Roman legions in conventional engagement. Antiochus had selected this historically significant position with careful attention to its tactical advantages. The narrow pass between mountains and sea appeared to neutralize Roman numerical superiority while maximizing effectiveness of his own disciplined formation. The Roman assault demonstrated tactical sophistication that had made the legions masters of Mediterranean warfare. Rather than attempting direct frontal attacks against the phalanx, the consul Manius Acilius Glabrio deployed his forces in complex maneuver designed to exploit the defensive position's inherent weaknesses. While the main body of legions engaged the Seleucid center, specialized units moved through the mountains to outflank the defensive line and attack from unexpected directions. This maneuver, reminiscent of the Persian strategy that had defeated Leonidas at the same location 3 centuries earlier, created panic among Seleucid troops who found themselves trapped between converging Roman attacks. The retreat from Thermopylae forced Antiochus to abandon his European ambitions and concentrate remaining forces in Asia Minor. The Battle of Magnesia in 190 BC represented culmination of the Roman-Seleucid War and would prove one of the most decisive engagements in ancient military history. Antiochus assembled the largest army of his reign for this final confrontation, over 70,000 men representing the full diversity of Seleucid military traditions. The royal army that deployed on the plains near Magnesia included the traditional phalanx units and cataphract cavalry that had carried Seleucid arms to victory across 3 continents, plus 54 war elephants from Indian allies. The engagement began with traditional exchange of missiles between light troops but quickly escalated into decisive cavalry action. Antiochus personally led the right-wing cataphracts in massive charge that initially achieved spectacular success, breaking through Roman cavalry formations. But his absence from the main battle line proved crucial to the engagement's final outcome. While Antiochus achieved local success on the right, the center of his army faced disciplined advance of Roman legions whose tactical superiority over phalanx formations had been demonstrated repeatedly throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The war elephants positioned at key points initially created panic among Roman ranks. However, Roman tactical innovations quickly neutralized their effectiveness as specialized units armed with javelins targeted the mahouts controlling each animal. Once their handlers were killed or wounded, the elephants became uncontrollable and often turned back into their own formations, trampling Seleucid infantry. The sight of these magnificent beasts, many wounded and maddened by pain, charging through their own ranks became symbol of the Seleucid collapse that followed. The destruction of the Seleucid center proceeded with devastating speed once Roman legions penetrated the phalanx formation. The gladius, the Roman short sword designed for thrusting attacks, proved far more effective than the long pikes that became useless once enemy forces closed to intimate range. Seleucid casualties exceeded 50,000 men, including most of the empire's veteran phalanxes and cataphract cavalry, while Roman casualties numbered fewer than 400. This catastrophic defeat effectively ended Seleucid military power and forced Antiochus to accept whatever terms Rome chose to impose. The Treaty of Apamea, negotiated in 188 BC, dismantled the Seleucid Empire as a great power and established Roman hegemony throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The terms imposed by Roman negotiators reflected both the Republic's strategic objectives and its determination to prevent any revival of Seleucid military capabilities. Antiochus was required to abandon all territories west of the Taurus Mountains, effectively surrendering Asia Minor. The massive indemnity of 15,000 talents to be paid over 12 years would drain the royal treasury. The treaty's military clauses proved equally devastating. The Royal Navy was limited to 10 ships, while the prohibition on war elephants eliminated one of the most distinctive elements of Seleucid military capability. The death of Antiochus III in 187 BC while attempting to plunder a temple in Elam marked the end of the last great Seleucid monarch and beginning of dynastic instability that would characterize the empire's remaining history. His son, Seleucus IV Philopator, inherited a kingdom burdened by crushing debt payments to Rome and facing rebellions throughout territories. The assassination of Seleucus IV in 175 BC brought his brother Antiochus IV Epiphanes to the throne at a moment when the empire faced its most severe internal crisis. The new king, who'd spent years as hostage in Rome and possessed intimate knowledge of Roman political methods, believed only radical reforms could restore Seleucid power. His Hellenization policies represented systematic attempt to create cultural unity throughout the empire's remaining territories by promoting Greek customs, religious practices, and political institutions. This program went far beyond voluntary cultural exchange that had characterized earlier Seleucid policy, instead employing royal authority to enforce conformity with Greek standards. The establishment of gymnasia in major cities, promotion of Greek education, and encouragement of Greek religious festivals were designed to create unified Hellenistic culture. The Sixth Syrian War erupted in 170 BC when Antiochus IV invaded Egypt to exploit dynastic disputes following Ptolemy VI's succession. The king's initial success in capturing Memphis and establishing control over most of Lower Egypt appeared to restore Seleucid power to levels not seen since the reign of Antiochus III. However, this triumph proved illusory when Roman intervention forced humiliating withdrawal, demonstrating limits of Seleucid independence. The Roman ultimatum delivered by Gaius Popilius Laenas became legendary. The Roman senator's famous gesture of drawing a circle in the sand around Antiochus IV and demanding immediate decision about withdrawal from Egypt showed that the Seleucid Empire had become a Roman client state. The humiliation at Eleusis marked turning point in Seleucid fortunes that would reverberate throughout the empire's remaining territories. Antiochus IV's forced withdrawal demonstrated the reality of Roman supremacy and exposed fundamental weakness of an empire that could no longer project power beyond its core territories without foreign permission. The king's death in 164 BC while campaigning in the eastern territories created immediate succession crisis that would plague the empire for remainder of its existence. The emergence of Alexander Ballas as rival claimant to the Seleucid throne in 152 BC introduced new dimension to the empire's internal struggles. Ballas, who claimed to be son of Antiochus IV, appeared in Rome with documentation purporting to establish his legitimacy, though most contemporary observers suspected he was impostor sponsored by enemies of the reigning dynasty. The civil war that erupted between Demetrius I and Alexander Ballas revealed extent to which the Seleucid Empire had fragmented into competing power centers whose loyalty could no longer be taken for granted. Alexander Ballas's victory at the Battle of the Oenoporus River in 150 BC eliminated Demetrius I and established precedent for foreign intervention in Seleucid succession disputes that would characterize the empire's remaining history. The battle's outcome resulted not from superior generalship, but from defection of key units, whose commanders had been secretly negotiating with Ballas's agents. Demetrius's Iranian cavalry, whose families had served the Seleucid crown since the empire's foundation, abandoned their positions at the crucial moment, leaving the royal phalanx exposed to flanking attacks. But here's where things get really chaotic. The rise of Diodotus Tryphon as military commander under Alexander Ballas introduced another destabilizing element. Tryphon, whose origins remain obscure but who possessed considerable military talent, initially served as loyal general, but his growing influence positioned him as potential alternative to the established royal house. The return of Demetrius II Nicator in 147 BC, son of the defeated Demetrius I, created three-way struggle for the Seleucid throne that paralyzed imperial administration and invited foreign intervention. Meanwhile, external enemies moved systematically to exploit imperial weakness. The most significant threat emerged from the east, where Mithridates' Tars of Parthia had spent decades consolidating control over the Iranian plateau and building military capabilities necessary for major westward expansion. Mithridates' invasion of Media in 148 BC marked the beginning of systematic Parthian expansion that would ultimately reduce the Seleucid Empire to rump state controlling little more than northern Syria and parts of Mesopotamia. The fall of Ecbatana, the ancient capital of Media, to Parthian forces in 147 BC eliminated Seleucid control over one of the empire's most important administrative centers and deprived the royal treasury of crucial revenues. The Parthian advance into Mesopotamia during 141 BC represented even more serious threat, as this region contained the empire's most productive agricultural areas and most important commercial centers. The capture of Seleucia on the Tigris, the great city that Seleucus I had founded as administrative capital of his eastern territories, symbolized complete reversal of fortune. The capture of Demetrius II by Parthian forces in 139 BC during his ill-conceived expedition to recover lost eastern territories eliminated the last Seleucid monarch who possessed both undisputed legitimacy and significant military resources. His defeat at the Battle of the Great Zab River and subsequent captivity in Hyrcania removed him from the political equation. The emergence of Antiochus VII Alcidates as the new Seleucid claimant represented the last serious attempt to restore the empire to its former power. Antiochus VII's initial campaigns demonstrated military capabilities that would make him the most formidable Seleucid ruler since Antiochus III. The king's systematic reduction of Tryphon's strongholds throughout Syria employed sophisticated siege techniques combining traditional Hellenistic methods with innovations learned from Roman engineering practices. The siege of Dor in 138 BC revealed both strengths and limitations of Antiochus VII's restored military machine. The king's forces completely surrounded the coastal fortress and constructed elaborate siege works. Tryphon's death eliminated the last significant internal challenger. With the western territories secured, Antiochus VII could finally address the ambitious project of reconquering eastern territories lost to Parthian expansion. The army he assembled during 130 BC represented the largest military force the Seleucid Empire had fielded since the reign of Antiochus III. The initial phases of Antiochus VII's eastern expedition achieved remarkable success. Parthian forces proved unable to halt the advance of well-organized and professionally led army. The king's forces systematically recaptured major cities of Mesopotamia, including Babylon and Seleucia on the Tigris. These victories restored imperial control over territories, generating enormous revenues during the empire's golden age. But then disaster struck. The approach of winter in 129 BC forced Antiochus VII to disperse his army among the cities of Media, where troops could be quartered during harsh mountain winter. This decision, while tactically sound, proved strategically disastrous as it divided Seleucid forces into isolated garrisons that could be attacked individually. The systematic uprising that erupted throughout Media during winter of 129–128 BC demonstrated effectiveness of Parthian intelligence networks. Local populations attacked Seleucid garrisons simultaneously in dozens of cities, transforming what had appeared to be secure occupation into desperate struggle for survival. The Battle of the Zab River, fought in harsh winter conditions, represented final confrontation between Seleucid and Parthian forces for control of the Iranian world. Phraates II had assembled approximately 50,000 men for this decisive engagement. Antiochus VII's deployment reflected both his tactical skill and recognition that this engagement would determine not only the campaign's fate, but survival of the Seleucid Empire as significant power. The decisive moment came when Phraates II personally led massive cavalry charge against the Seleucid right flank. Antiochus VII's response demonstrated personal courage that had made him the most respected Seleucid ruler since Antiochus III. He led his guard cavalry in countercharge designed to restore his army's tactical position. Contemporary accounts describe the king fighting in front ranks, his purple cloak and golden diadem making him conspicuous target. His horse fell, pierced by multiple Parthian arrows, but the king continued fighting on foot until a cataphract lance finally ended his life, and with it, the last realistic hope of Seleucid restoration. The destruction of the royal army that followed was complete and systematic. Few Seleucid survivors who managed to escape brought news of disaster to remaining imperial territories, where the king's death created immediate succession crisis. The return of Demetrius II from Parthian captivity in 129 BC, negotiated by Phraates II as part of his strategy for destabilizing remaining Seleucid territories, introduced another complicating factor. The former king, who'd spent decades in comfortable exile at the Parthian court, returned to find his empire reduced to a fraction of former size. The simultaneous emergence of multiple claimants to the Seleucid throne reflected complete breakdown of traditional succession system. Alexander the Terrible, Zabinus established himself in Damascus with Egyptian support. Antiochus VIII, Grypus, son of Demetrius II, commanded loyalty among Syrian nobles. Antiochus IX, Cyzicenus possessed equally valid dynastic claims and controlled significant military forces. The civil wars that erupted between these competing claimants during the 120s BC completed transformation of the Seleucid Empire from great power into a collection of petty kingdoms, whose rulers spent more energy fighting each other than defending territories against external enemies. The rise of local strongmen throughout the empire's remaining territories reflected collapse of central authority. Arab chieftains in the Syrian desert established independent principalities controlling caravan routes and collecting tolls that had previously flowed to the royal treasury. Armenian nobles in northern territories acknowledged nominal Seleucid suzerainty while pursuing independent foreign policies. Iturean expansion into the Lebanese mountains demonstrated how local populations could exploit imperial weakness to establish autonomous territories that gradually evolved into independent kingdoms. The Nabatean kingdom centered at Petra represented perhaps the most successful example of how former Seleucid subjects could achieve independence and prosperity through adaptation to changing political circumstances. The Nabateans, whose ancestors had served as caravan guides throughout the Arabian Peninsula, exploited collapse of imperial control over incense routes to establish commercial empire extending from the Red Sea to Damascus. Their sophisticated understanding of desert warfare and control of water sources made them virtually invulnerable to weakened military forces. The transformation of major cities from imperial administrative centers into autonomous city-states marked another dimension of the empire's fragmentation. Seleucia in Pieria, the great port that had served as Antioch's connection to the Mediterranean world, established its own government and began conducting independent foreign relations with Rome and other powers. Damascus similarly evolved into independent power center, whose rulers acknowledged nominal Seleucid authority while pursuing policies determined by local interests. The growing Roman influence in Syrian affairs during this period reflected the Republic's recognition that the Seleucid Empire's collapse created both opportunities and dangers requiring careful management. Roman merchants and diplomats had established extensive networks throughout former imperial territories. The Republic's policy of supporting weak rulers who could be easily controlled while preventing emergence of any power strong enough to challenge Roman hegemony required constant diplomatic intervention in succession disputes plaguing remaining Seleucid territories. The intervention of Tigranes of Armenia in Syrian affairs during 83 BC represented fundamental transformation in political dynamics governing the region since the Seleucid Empire's foundation. The Armenian king, whose realm had expanded systematically during previous decades through conquest of territories in eastern Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia, possessed both military capability and strategic vision necessary to impose unity on fractured Syrian territories through external conquest. Tigranes' army that crossed the Euphrates in late 83 BC represented the most formidable military force that had operated in Syria since campaigns of Antiochus VII, approximately 100,000 men drawn from throughout the Armenian Empire. The systematic conquest of Syrian cities that followed demonstrated both effectiveness of Armenian military organization and extent to which local populations had grown weary of civil warfare plaguing their territories. Damascus fell after brief siege. Antioch's capitulation in 83 BC marked effective end of independent Seleucid rule. The administrative integration of Syria into the Armenian system revealed Tigranes' sophisticated understanding of governmental challenges involved in ruling diverse populations across vast territories. Rather than attempting to impose uniform Armenian institutions, he adapted existing Seleucid administrative practices while inserting Armenian officials at key positions. This approach preserved expertise of experienced administrators while ensuring Armenian control over crucial functions like tax collection and military recruitment. The cultural policies Tigranes implemented reflected his recognition that successful imperial rule required accommodation with existing social and religious institutions. Greek educational institutions, including gymnasia that had served as centers of Hellenistic culture for centuries, continued to operate under Armenian patronage. The great temple of Apollo at Daphne received substantial investments enhancing its architectural grandeur while accommodating Armenian religious practices. The economic transformation of Syria under Armenian administration demonstrated Tigranes' understanding of commercial relationships that had made the region prosperous during the Seleucid Golden Age. Restoration of security along trade routes encouraged revival of commercial activity disrupted by decades of civil warfare. The standardization of weights, measures, and currency throughout Armenian Empire facilitated trade relationships extending from the Caucasus Mountains to the Egyptian frontier. The survival of Seleucid claimants in marginal territories beyond Armenian control created ongoing complications. Antiochus III Asiaticus maintained precarious existence in Coele-Syria, where he commanded loyalty of military units whose families had served the Seleucid crown for generations. Philip II, Philorameus, established himself in Damascus after Tigranes' forces had moved northward. Their competing embassies to Rome, each claiming exclusive right to Seleucid inheritance, provided Roman senators with opportunities to influence Syrian affairs while avoiding direct military intervention. The Roman civil wars that erupted during the 80s BC created new opportunities and dangers for surviving Seleucid territories. Lucius Cornelius Sulla's conflict with Gaius Marius transformed the Eastern Mediterranean into theatre, where Roman factional disputes played out through proxy conflicts between local rulers aligning themselves with different Roman patrons. The Seleucid claimants, despite their reduced circumstances, possessed sufficient military capability to serve as valuable allies for Roman commanders needing Eastern support. The Roman civil wars reached their decisive phase when Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus arrived in Syria during summer of 64 BC with extraordinary proconsular authority and mandate to reorganize the entire region according to Roman strategic interests. Pompey's eastern command had already achieved spectacular success against Mithridates VI of Pontus. The general, who now turned his attention to remnants of the Seleucid Empire, commanded approximately 60,000 veteran legionaries whose experience had prepared them for complex political and military challenges awaiting in Syria. The Syria that Pompey encountered bore little resemblance to prosperous heartland of great Hellenistic Empire. 2 decades of Armenian occupation under Tigranes had been followed by gradual reassertion of local autonomy as competing Seleucid claimants, Arab chieftains, and urban oligarchies carved out independent territories from collapsing imperial structure. Antiochus III Asiaticus, who had managed to maintain precarious control over Damascus and portions of southern Syria, represented last vestige of legitimate Seleucid authority. The meeting between Pompey and Antiochus III in summer of 64 BC took place in Roman camp outside Damascus, where disparity between 2 leaders' circumstances became immediately apparent. The Roman commander, surrounded by staff officers and protected by veteran centurions, received the Seleucid king with courtesy due legitimate monarch, while making clear their relationship would be determined by Roman strategic requirements. Antiochus III, accompanied by small retinue whose threadbare clothing revealed desperate circumstances, attempted to maintain royal dignity while essentially pleading for Roman recognition. Pompey's systematic evaluation of territorial claims presented by various Seleucid pretenders revealed extent to which dynastic fragmentation had rendered traditional concepts of legitimacy meaningless. Philip II Philorameus dispatched envoys presenting genealogical charts demonstrating his superior hereditary rights while simultaneously offering substantial bribes for Roman recognition. Demetrius III Eucharius claimed authority over regions he'd not controlled for years, while promising military support for Roman operations. Pompey's ultimate decision to abolish the Seleucid monarchy and incorporate Syria directly into the Roman provincial system reflected both practical considerations about administrative efficiency and strategic calculations about regional stability. The formal ceremony that announced this decision took place in Antioch during September 64 BC with representatives from throughout the former empire assembled to witness transformation of territories that had maintained nominal independence for nearly 2.5 centuries. The Roman commander read the Senatus Consultum establishing the new province, while Seleucid royal regalia were formally deposited in the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus as symbols of Rome's victory. The administrative framework Pompey established for new Syrian province demonstrated sophisticated governmental methods enabling Rome to manage diverse populations across the Mediterranean world. Rather than imposing uniform Roman institutions throughout territories encompassing multiple ethnic groups and cultural traditions, he created flexible system preserving local autonomy where possible while ensuring Roman control over strategic functions. The provincial capital at Antioch received extensive investments in infrastructure and public buildings symbolizing Roman power. The fate of surviving members of the Seleucid royal family illustrated both Roman pragmatism and personal dimensions of imperial collapse. Antiochus III received substantial financial settlement, enabling him to purchase property in Rome where he could live comfortably while remaining under discreet surveillance. The younger members of royal family were enrolled in Roman educational institutions where they could acquire skills necessary for careers in imperial service while losing cultural connections that might have made them focal points for anti-Roman sentiment. The death of Antiochus III Asiaticus in 64 BC and Pompey's formal abolition of the Seleucid monarchy marked not merely end of dynasty but conclusion of extraordinary experiment in cross-cultural governance that had shaped the ancient world for nearly 3 centuries. The empire that Seleucus I had carved from eastern territories of Alexander's conquests had evolved into something unprecedented, a vast multi-ethnic state successfully integrating Greek, Iranian, Mesopotamian, and Semitic populations under single administrative framework, while fostering cultural synthesis on scale not seen again until the modern era. The Seleucid contribution to Hellenistic culture extended far beyond mere transplantation of Greek institutions to Eastern territories. The empire served as vast laboratory for cultural experimentation, where Greek architectural principles merged with local building traditions to create distinctive regional styles influencing construction throughout the ancient world. Urban planning under the Seleucids achieved levels of sophistication not matched until Roman imperial expansion reached its peak. Cities like Antioch and Seleucia on the Tigris incorporated Greek orthogonal layouts with Eastern concepts of ceremonial space. The artistic synthesis that flourished under Seleucid patronage produced distinctive styles combining Greek naturalistic sculpture with Eastern symbolic traditions. Religious syncretism achieved unprecedented theological sophistication as Greek philosophical concepts merged with Eastern mystery traditions and Mesopotamian astronomical knowledge. The spread of Greek language throughout Seleucid territories created foundation for cultural unity, characterizing the Eastern Mediterranean world for centuries after empire's collapse. The administrative innovations developed by Seleucid rulers provided models influencing subsequent empires throughout ancient and medieval periods. The flexible system of provincial administration, balancing central authority with local autonomy, enabled effective governance across cultural boundaries. The integration of diverse military traditions within unified command structures created armies operating effectively across varied terrain. The Seleucid approach to managing ethnic diversity through cultural accommodation rather than forced assimilation established precedents influencing imperial policy throughout the ancient world. The economic legacy proved even more enduring than political innovations. The trade networks and commercial practices developed during 3 centuries of imperial rule continued functioning long after dynasty's collapse. Urban development established patterns of city planning and municipal organization influencing urban growth throughout the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries. Agricultural innovations provided technological foundations supporting population growth and economic development for millennia. In the grand sweep of ancient history, the Seleucid Empire stands as remarkable achievement in cross-cultural governance and crucial link in the chain of development connecting the classical world with cosmopolitan civilizations that would follow. The empire's ultimate dissolution marked not failure but transformation as its contributions were absorbed into larger historical currents shaping the ancient world's evolution. If you enjoyed this journey through the rise and fall of one of history's most ambitious empires, from Seleucus's 500 war elephants to Antiochus the Great's reconquest of the East, from cultural synthesis bridging Greece and Persia to the final Roman annexation, subscribe to Flow of History for more deep dives into the civilizations that shaped our world.